genel izleyici kitlesi için uygundur.
Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden, farklı milletlerden konuklarla bölgesel ve küresel meselelere dair farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta nükleer konusunu konuşacağız. Dünyada nükleer silahlanma yarışı son dönemde giderek kızışıyor. Ülkelerden nükleer silah konusunda birbiri ardına açıklamalar, adımlar geliyor. Özellikle Rusya'nın Ukrayna işgali sonrası nükleer savaş tehdidi de giderek artıyor. Bir yandan küresel enerji ve iklim krizi de nükleer enerjiyi yeniden gündeme taşıdı. Daha önce nükleerden vazgeçme niyetindeki ülkeler bile tutum değişikliğine gidiyor. İşte bu hafta saat farkında giderek daha fazla gündemde yer tutan ve görünüşe göre daha da tutacak olan nükleer meselesini ele alacağız. Kiminle? ABD'den çok kıymetli bir bilim insanı, uzun yıllardır nükleer alanında çalışan Columbia Üniversitesi Kimya Bölümü öğretim üyesi, aynı zamanda ABD merkezli Nükleer Çağ Barış Vakfı Başkanı Doktor Ivana Nikolic Hughes bizlerle. Kendisiyle dünyada giderek kızışan nükleer silahlanma yarışı, nükleer savaş tehlikesi, nükleer enerji gibi konuları biraz teknik tarafından ele alarak anlamaya çalışacağız. Welcome Professor. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Feyza, for having me. I'm delighted to be with you.
Thank you very much. Professor, the nuclear arms race has been intensifying recently. Almost all countries are developing or planning to develop their nuclear capabilities. On the other hand, the risk of a possible nuclear war has been rising, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Putin has also, as you know, signaled it several times, has made some warnings. So I wonder, as a scientist, first of all, do you share this concern with others who think that there is a serious risk of a nuclear war? And who is posing the most serious threat?
Thank you, Feyza, for that question. That's really such an important question. And there's simply, in my mind, no doubt that the risk of nuclear weapons use has increased since the start of the Ukraine war. Exact estimates may vary, but really everyone agrees that the risk has not been greater than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place just over 60 years ago. But the important distinction I want to make between the Cuban Missile Crisis and what's happening today is that the Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. And this war is nearing its one-year anniversary with almost seemingly no peaceful end in sight. In the words of Professor Marty Hellman from Stanford University, those who discount the possibility of nuclear war due to the Ukraine war are probably right, but probably, in Professor Hellman's opinion and my own, is just not good enough when human civilization as we know it is at stake, when survival of humanity and other life on the planet is at stake. This is just not acceptable. So to me, there are really two important conclusions to draw from this conflict. One is the absolute imperative of peaceful negotiations to bring this war to a peaceful end. In my mind, that such actors who are calling for this and who enable this should be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, not be vilified. I think that Turkey has an important role to play on this, as it has with President Erdogan at the start of the war, with the grain deal. I think this is really absolutely critical at this time. Mm-hmm. The second conclusion that I draw from the conflict is the absolute imperative of getting rid of nuclear weapons. The world should not be at the whim of the nuclear weapon states. It should not be held hostage, and the getting rid of nuclear weapons would enable us to truly reach a stable, multipolar global world in which many actors around the world are playing an important role in international politics. And they're not just subject to whims of one or two or five nuclear weapon states. Mm-hmm. The one last point I want to make, Feyza, is that you asked about who poses the most serious threat. And here I really want to stress that all nuclear weapons are bad. It doesn't matter who owns them or who possesses them. Any nuclear weapons use would be unthinkable and would be horrible. And here, we're not just concerned about deliberate use. We're also concerned about things like accidents and miscalculations. And careful study of the history of the Cold War teaches us that we had way too many close calls. We've been led to believe the nuclear deterrence works, the nuclear weapons have kept us safe, but really careful study by people like Benoit Pelopidis at Sciences Po in Paris show us that what has really happened is that we have been lucky. And in the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, luck is not a strategy. We have to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Professor, by the way, I also wonder, could you compare the countries as of now based on their nuclear capabilities for us? Because Russia is, I think, the #1 country who has, and also could you clarify for me what is the difference between tactical nuclear weapons and strategic weapons? And also United States, Russia and others, could you compare these countries, the biggest nuclear weapon states for us? And how do we measure these countries, these powers, by their, nuclear warheads? So how do we exactly measure their nuclear capabilities?
Yeah, another excellent question, Feyza. In the world today, we have close to 13,000 nuclear warheads. And most of these are 10 to 100 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Over 90% of these nuclear warheads are in the possession of US and Russia. Those two countries, and there are different ways of counting, and I can talk a little bit about the tactical versus strategic nuclear weapons difference. There are different ways of counting, but it's fair to say that Russia and the US are comparable on the order of 6,000 nuclear warheads each, and then everyone else is far, far below. So China had in about, I would say 10 years ago, about 300 nuclear warheads. They seem to be not just modernizing, but increasing their nuclear weapons count. They're at about 350. And while we can absolutely criticize that increase in nuclear weapons, it's also absolutely hypocritical for the US and Russia, which have 6,000, to criticize someone who's at 350. So to me, the first order of business is US and Russia need to come down very, very significantly. After China, we have France and UK on the order of 250 each. And then there is India and Pakistan on the order of 150 each. Israel, which is thought to have about 90 warheads, and North Korea, which is thought to have about 40 to 50. So the scales are just very, very different. And to me, disarmament efforts need to start with US and Russia coming down in terms of their numbers. Now, you asked about tactical versus strategic nuclear weapons. Tactical are sort of described and kind of defined as weapons that have yields from 1 to 50 kilotons, and also kind of medium range. You can send them at a distance of, say, 300 to 500 kilometers, something on those orders. 1 to 50 kilotons of energy yield for a nuclear weapon. The Hiroshima bomb was a 15 kiloton yield. So these tactical weapons could be even more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. So they're by no means small, but they are smaller than the strategic nuclear weapons, which can be in the hundreds of kilotons. And when we were testing nuclear weapons during the Cold War, we were in the many megatons. In fact, in the Marshall Islands, where the U.S. tested nuclear weapons, there was a bomb that was tested that was 15 megatons, so 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Now, the use of a strategic nuclear weapon, say an attack on a city in Europe, in North America, in Russia, wherever, would cause absolutely unthinkable human suffering. And at some level, the existence of these weapons really is, in the words of Veronique Ristori from the International Committee of the Red Cross, is about how much human suffering we would be willing to inflict or permit in times of war. So just unacceptable. On the other hand, we're not now in 1945 when the US has two weapons and uses one on Hiroshima and the other on Nagasaki. We're at a time when these intercontinental ballistic missiles could deliver up to 10 warheads simultaneously to nearby or distant targets. So there could be, the scale of suffering would be unimaginable. And the last thing is that these kinds of attacks could cause hundreds of millions of people to die. But what is even more important for everyone in the world to recognize is that that's not where it would end. What would happen even in a regional nuclear war like between India and Pakistan is that we would have, because of the fires caused by the attacks, the soot that would go into the atmosphere, that would block incoming sunlight. It would cause temperatures to go down. It would lead to failure of agriculture. And it would essentially mean that people throughout the planet would starve to death. India-Pakistan regional nuclear war would lead to 2 billion deaths from starvation only, not counting the victims of the attack. And US and Russia, using 1/3 of their current arsenals, would lead to 5.4 billion deaths throughout the world. This is why I said early on, when human civilization as we know it is at stake, when humanity's survival is at stake, the existence of these weapons is just no longer acceptable.
Well, this is very scary, Professor, and I also want to ask you at this point, because there are also international agreements banning nuclear weapons from testing to development, as far as I know. So how binding are these agreements in reality, particularly for nuclear-capable states? Is there any accountability for these nations? What do you think?
There is some, but we need to bring this to an end. The treaty that is not just one of the largest international armed security treaties, but also one of the largest treaties in the world, UN treaties, period, is called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It entered into force in 1970. According to that treaty, according to Article 6 of that treaty, first of all, the treaty sets up a structure in which 5 countries that had developed nuclear weapons by that point, and that's the US, Russia, China, UK, and France, those 5 countries are allowed to keep their nuclear weapons while everybody else, essentially, the term is, doesn't proliferate, right? So there's no expansion. However, according to Article 6 of that treaty, the 5 nuclear weapon states are supposed to negotiate in good faith towards not just nuclear disarmament, but towards total and complete disarmament. And 52 years later, they have not done so. In August, we had the NPT review conference, which failed to reach an outcome document. The document that was produced at the end of the conference was very, very mild and vague on issues of nuclear disarmament, and it's time to hold those states to account. The good news is that countries of the global south and other leaders like Austria and Ireland in Europe have been working for the past almost 6 years on a treaty called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW. That treaty entered into force 2 years ago tomorrow. And this is a treaty that now has 68 ratifications, 92 signatory states. This is where we need to go. This is a treaty that puts nuclear disarmament, that provides a mechanism for it, and it's just incredibly important that it is our best hope to get rid of nuclear weapons.
I see. Professor, by the way, I also wonder this nuclear energy issue, because there is this, never-ending debate on nuclear energy, and war in Ukraine and now climate change are pushing some countries to return to nuclear power, as you know, despite some remaining concerns of another Chernobyl or Fukushima. So I really wonder, is nuclear energy really good for climate, and how safe and clean is it? And technically, I also wonder one more thing. Nuclear weapons and nuclear power share several common features, and there's a danger that having more nuclear power stations in the world could mean more nuclear weapons. Is it the case?
I share those concerns, Feyza, and I absolutely recognize also that we are living at a time of multiple existential crises, including climate change. So I recognize that this is a complex issue. My personal opinion is that nuclear power is not our solution. I think that the current plants that are in existence should be phased out in due time, but no new plants should be, power plants should be built, because we should be investing those resources in the truly renewable and sustainable energy sources that are not going to cause the same kind of environmental damage that nuclear energy has already done and has the potential to further do. When this was developed in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, people talked about this being the energy of the future, being perfectly safe. Physicists, very, very smart people, standing behind this as a kind of, perfect solution to all of our problems. And in 1979, we had here in the United States, in Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island accident that was due to equipment malfunction. Then just 7 years later, it was Chernobyl due to human error. Then in 2011, we had Fukushima natural disaster. And now we have war in a country with 4 nuclear power plants and 15 reactors. We do not need to find more ways of things going wrong with nuclear energy. I'll just add that nuclear energy is a problem even before we start producing it, with things like uranium mining. It is also a problem with the waste. The waste has not been solved as globally as to what we do with it. And I just think that we really have to move away from nuclear energy and not think of it as a solution, but actually recognize it as a problem. And the last point, which you made in a way, is that as long as we have nuclear energy, even if we succeed today with the TPNW and get rid of all of the nuclear weapons in the world, as long as we have nuclear energy, countries will still be capable of producing nuclear warheads once again. And so that's another reason why we do eventually have to get rid of all of it, in my opinion.
I see. One last question, Professor Hughes, because I wonder, this is a very important issue for the region, especially for our region in the Middle East. Iran has been enriching uranium for a very long time, as you know. Is Iran ready to build its own nuclear bomb, or it's still far from it? I really wonder this.
Yeah, I think they could be fairly close if they're not there already. But again, I want to warn against, the kind of thinking that this one actor having it is bad, but everybody else having it is good. It's not. We need to get rid of all of them. And I'll just add that people often think that the only time humans have suffered from nuclear weapons was the attacks in Japan on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That is also absolutely not true. That suffering includes a long legacy of nuclear testing in places like the Marshall Islands, where the U.S. tested nuclear weapons, in Kazakhstan, where the Soviets tested nuclear weapons, in Algeria and French Polynesia, where the French tested Australia and Kiribati, where the UK tested, as well as American Southwest. So many regions, so many affected communities. And I'll just say that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons doesn't just ban nuclear weapons, but also has humanitarian provisions to help, to assist victims of nuclear use and testing, and to remediate those environments, which is a really key, important issues for us to go forward with, and for the world to recognize the people who have suffered due to these weapons.
We have a few minutes left, so you are also the president of Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Professor. So could you please summarize in a minute for us what your activities are in order to get rid of these nuclear weapons fully?
Yeah, absolutely, Feyza. So the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation has been in existence since 1982, really with a singular mission towards and a commitment to a peaceful world and one that is free of nuclear weapons. And so we're absolutely delighted with the passage and entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and that is where most of our activities lie. I spend a lot of time with my colleagues. I have a wonderful colleague, Christian Chibanu, and we spend a lot of time at the United Nations, where we try to really advocate for the treaty and support the strengthening, the universalization, and the implementation of the treaty. In particular, we're very involved with these articles on humanitarian provisions. They're called Articles 6 and 7. We also work really hard on educating and advocating for a world free of nuclear weapons through programs, through engaging the general population. This is just, as you know, now it seems to be with the war that it's a topic that people are kind of tuning into, but for a long time, since the end of the Cold War, it was as if these weapons had disappeared, as if there was no longer any threat. And so reaching the general populations in the United States and elsewhere, and having them recognize how important this is really a key of what we do. We also work very hard to engage young people. We have initiatives that not just engage young people, but also bring together the issue of nuclear weapons with the issue of climate change. So we're very, very busy. There's a world to save, and we are committed, absolutely committed to doing so.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. It was it was a pleasure for me, but it was very scary at the same time talking to you.
I have to apologize for scaring people, but I think it's important for us to recognize what the dangers are, so we can. Definitely. This is one of those dangers that we can actually solve. We created it, and we can get rid of these weapons, and we can solve the problem.
Right. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, Professor. Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta nükleer konusunu konuştuk. Nükleer alanında uzun yıllardır çalışmaları olan Kolombiya Üniversitesi Kimya Bölümü öğretim üyesi, aynı zamanda ABD merkezli Nükleer Çağ Barış Vakfı Başkanı Dr. Ivana Nikolic Hughes ile konuştuk. Artan nükleer savaş tehdidini, nükleer enerjiyi ve nükleerle ilintili pek çok konuyu biraz da teknik açıdan ele aldık anlamak üzere. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla görüşmek dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.